Okay, so we're just getting on with the recording. So, Darktable mode. So tethering, you can hook up and take pictures with your computer. If you're doing stuff in the studio, this is really handy. We can maybe play with that if we have some time. But the main modes we want to look at is the light table mode and the darkroom mode. That's not the right window. There we go. So this is Darktable when we fire it up. And this, we are in light table mode. So brief overview of the interface. In the main section is kind of your main window. And in here we've got a bunch of photos that are in this current collection I've got opened. On the top we've got a filter where we can change which photos show up in the list. Along the top here, we've got the different modes we can switch to. And at the bottom, there's some additional filters for setting the number of stars or the colors, and we'll talk about that. And then along the left is some info. The way they've got it laid out is on the left is some info, and then on the right is where you make your manipulations. So here's where we can import images into our collection. Here's info about it, our recently used collections, so we can switch back and forth. So the first thing we have to do is we have to get some photos in. So the important thing about Darktable is that it is a strictly non-destructive editor. It won't ever make a change to your original photo. This is a good thing, I think. As you make changes to the photo, or as you make developments in Darktable, I guess I shouldn't say they're changes, it writes those out as a series of steps that are being applied, and it saves them in what they call a sidecar file. So they create a file called an XMP that sits in the same directory as your original photo, and every time you pull up Darktable, it finds that file and then applies all those steps each time. It's a little more CPU intensive, but guarantees that your files aren't ever touched, which actually means that you can do edits on JPEGs as well and be sure that you're not going to be losing quality every time you save your changes. On that topic, there is no save button in Darktable. Everything's committed when it's done. But because you have each step saved, you can always roll back to wherever you want to go. So when we import, we can scan for a folder. And the important thing to know here is that when you import an image or import a folder, it does not copy that into like a Darktable collection somewhere. It leaves the file where it is, and it just brings it in to be edited in Darktable. So it's really not a photo collection manager tool. Those are probably there's probably other tools out there that would serve a better purpose for that. So here I've got a bunch of pictures that I went out and took the other day. And then so we imported them. Same thing for importing a single image. You can just import one image. If you put an image name on a command line, it'll pop open. It'll edit it just like you can open it from your file manager or whatever you want. The one thing that's different is the scan for devices. So you can import. If I flip on my camera here. You can import directly from the camera instead of having to copy it, pop the SD card in, copy it over to your file, which you can certainly do. If we scan for devices, it should show up here. Yep, there's my Nikon camera. So if I click import from camera, it's going to scan the camera and give me a list of all the photos that are on the SD card that it could import. So here's my kid at his choir concert. So we give it a name here. And then in the global settings, it tells it where to import to. You can override the date. And then in the settings as well, there's a place to set parameters. You can use variable names for these. So it'll replace it'll name the directory with a date and with the job code, or date and the camera model, or whatever. There's about 20 different variables that you can use. I just do a simple date on mine. So now that we have our images in our collection, we need to sort through them and figure out which ones are the good ones, which ones are the bad ones. If you're anything like me, most of your pictures are not the ones that are keepers.
Is it smart enough to know images have already been imported?
So because it doesn't keep its own database, it doesn't matter. It really is, like once you close this out, like everything it knows about that collection is gone. So it has like these recently used collections, which it just keeps track of the file path. But beyond that, it loads everything up when you load the collection. So I guess it's smart enough by being dumb, like by not keeping everything from one instance to the next. It has to read it each time. So if I switch to this one in my backyard, it just reloads all these pictures. It rescans all those XMP sidecar files and applies all your changes. And that's where like these little color dots that I've set or my stars, those are stored in there. So as long as those XMP files are alongside your photos, it should find them just fine. Using our filters up here, we can filter based on whatever we've set on these pictures. So we can give each picture a rating. So if you highlight over them, you'll see that there's an X here. This is to reject an image. I usually do a quick scan through and find anything that's ended up being blurry or totally blown out, whatever just doesn't look great, and I just hit a reject on those. So we can quickly reject this one, and because I've got this set to only things that are 1 star or greater, all the rejected pictures, which have 0 stars, disappear out of the window. So if I change this to 2 stars, then it shows just the ones that I've tagged with 2 stars or greater. So by clicking on the stars, you can set, now I've set this to 4 stars or back to 2. You can click on a picture and set a color tag. There's some keyboard shortcuts for this as well. I think the F keys do the colors. I can't remember how to do the stars. So I like to scan through and just set all the ones, move them up to 2 stars, the ones I like, and then bump up my filter, and then kind of just work my way through there. And then I get to a point where I have a reasonable number of images that I want to work on, and then I'll hop over to darkroom mode and start editing. So along the right here, there's some things where you can manipulate the selection. You can do a few things as a batch, things like deleting, copying. You can create, if you do a duplicate, okay, so copy and move is moving the actual files. Duplicate is where it leaves the original picture and creates another workflow for it. So using the same raw data, you can create multiple files. So if you have one where you want to do a real tight crop and one where you want to do a further out crop or something like that, you can have multiple pictures without actually duplicating the image data. That's handy. You can also copy the entire history stack. So for example, I've got this one has a few things. So if I click copy, it'll show me all the things that have been applied. I can select whichever ones I want and copy them onto the stack, and then I can paste those onto another picture. So if you have a whole bunch in a series that all have the same lighting, you want to apply the same thing to them, copy that, the things you want to apply, paste it, saves you a lot of time. Of course, if you do paste, then you can select which ones you want to paste. If you do copy all and paste all, that just does all of them at once. And then there's a little button down here for export. You can export to a bunch of different things, Facebook, file on disk, Flickr. I mean, usually I export to JPEGs and then kind of manipulate it on my own after that. A bunch of different formats it supports. And then some options. So down here on the size, you can set, if you set it to zeros, it'll retain the original size. If you set either of these, it'll scale a maximum to that size, and then the other one, so if you set the width, it'll calculate the correct height that it should be based on the aspect ratio. It'll always maintain your aspect ratio correctly. So if you set both of them, whichever one is the higher, it'll go to that one and then calculate the other to match. So let's grab one of these images, and we'll just show you. I I grabbed these ones. I know these are ugly images, but I wanted to show you the difference between a JPEG and a RAW. So this is a RAW file, and this is a JPEG. And I've cranked up, so the pictures themselves weren't all that great, but what did I do? I dropped the highlight. I dropped the highlights all the way down. So this was the normal picture. It was a really blown out picture, which I did on purpose, I promise. Both of these were really blown out. So you've got these really bright highlights, really not a lot of contrast in the picture. So I dropped the highlights way down to just see how much of that detail we could recover. And you can see, you're starting to see, this is taken from up on the hill at Rock Canyon Park. Starting to see some of the mountain. You can actually, you can see a little bit of the mountain. There's some clouds up here. It's kind of hard to see on the projector, but you can make out a few things. But in this JPEG, not a lot. If you switch over to the RAW file, you can see there's a lot more detail in the city that you can pick up. There's a lot more contrast in there, a lot more detail in the hills. You can actually see this other hill, mountain over here. I promise you can see the clouds a little bit in there. So that's just that extra bit depth that you've got in the RAW file. So that's, I thought was a pretty good example of how that could be used. So we've got a brief tour around the interface here. So one thing to note is that each of these side pieces can be turned on or off by clicking on these arrows. So if you want to give yourself just a little bit more working room. You can also hit the tab key to make them just disappear and reappear. It'll retain your settings. So down here at the bottom, we've replaced the filter with a film strip. Shows you all the things in your collection. So you can scroll through and jump to any of them without having to go back to Lighttable mode.
And you can't filter them from there? You're basing it off your Lighttable filter?
Yeah, so the filter is up here. I had it hidden. So yeah, it'll apply that same filter to your film strip. And the sorting, the same thing. If I wanted to sort them by their rating, well, it's not really changing much. There we go. So applies, yeah, the same way. Along the left here, we've got our image info again, and we've got our history stack. So this is where I was referring to, where each of the things that you're applying to the picture are going to show up in that history stack. You can compress it, in which case it'll lump all those things together and there's no going back. So sometimes that's useful, sometimes not. I typically don't compress the history stack because I'm just too nervous about, what if I want to undo. Of course, you always have the option of throwing away the entire thing and starting from scratch, but if you want to be able to jump to a certain point, you can just click on anything and go to that point. So I can go back to the original picture, which here we see is very blown out. So when you open a picture for the very first time, I don't think I've made any changes to this one. Oh, I did. But no, not that one. I swear. Let's grab one that I haven't edited. All right, so here's one that hasn't been. That's a JPEG. All right, so the first time you open up a picture, it's going to apply the default set of filters. And that is the orientation, the sharpening, and the base curve. Every raw picture needs to be sharpened. Again, not being an engineer, I couldn't tell you exactly why, but it's the way that the stuff comes together, something. Anyway, they all need to be sharpened. So it applies the sharpening. And then it applies a base curve. It's just a curve, like your levels and curves, if you're familiar with those. And you have the option of altering that if you want. And it does it based on the name of the camera. So it tries to make a best guess. Like these types of cameras typically need a curve of this style. I find that these are sometimes pretty good, most times not so much. So feel free, not that you certainly could use a Pentax type, it's not locked to a certain, you can choose any of those presets you want. So you can play with them if you want, or change it. Or so an introduction to the modules. There's 3 buttons here. There's the on-off. So if we want to switch it off entirely and show what the original looked like. There's the presets, and those are different based on which module. Some of them have pre-built presets. Some of them are for storing your own presets. If we come up with something we like, we can create our own preset and have it auto-apply or only show for matching images. Really handy if you do the same thing over and over from set to set. Save a preset. And then this button here will reset to the module's defaults. It'll clear out all of your changes or any of your presets that you've done. So I actually don't like the base, the sharpen and the base. I don't like to do them in that order. And to date, I don't think it's possible to change those defaults. I've been looking on the forums. I think I got in one time and started looking at the code. I didn't get very far to try and figure out if there's a way to modify that. Haven't found it, so I normally go back to the original and do what I like to do is the denoise filter. It's based on the ISO level. It tries to guess based on the camera and what the settings were, how much denoising it should apply. And I find that's usually pretty good. And I like to apply denoising in every case. And then there's also a non-local denoiser, which does a more algorithm-based, a little more heavy-handed, but if something's got a lot of noise, it can really clear it up. And then I like to hit my sharpen and sharpen the image up. From there, I'll usually play with the curves and play with the light, but those are my 2 base ones. And then we should note about the white balance. So one of the awesome things about RAW is that your camera will still make its guess as to what the white balance should be. And you guys are you familiar with the concept of white balance? Different lights have different temperatures. So this room being lit with what I can only assume is the fluorescent lights would have more of a blue cast. If you're outside, it'd be a little warmer. Your incandescents are going to be even more so, more red, more yellow. So your camera's still going to make its guess and put that into the image. But because those channels are uncombined inside the RAW file, you can change the white balance whenever you want. So with a JPEG, you have to pick your white balance and go with it. With a RAW file, you can go back and change that anytime you like. And so that's extremely powerful. So it defaults to showing the camera's white balance. You can choose from any of the presets. You can do a spot white balance if you want. If I just click on it. It looks a little red to me. So then you can back it off. You can use the scroll wheel. You can grab it. You can also, if you right-click, you can do fine-tuning. There isn't a way, I don't think, to type in a specific number in the interface. You have to click on stuff. But yeah, so you right-click, and then you can kind of slide this thing back and forth to get exactly where you want. So the next part was showing you how to select the modules. So there are a lot of modules. I think there are 50 or 60 different modules that are available. And you can choose which ones you want to use. So that's down here under more modules. Let's slide this down so we'll have a little more space. And there's 3 different, you can see them here. So this one here is not selected. It's not enabled. It's there, but it's not turned on. The color balance here, because it's gray, that means that I've selected it. It's enabled. It shows up in its category. And then the base curve has a star, meaning that that's one of my favorites. So it shows up along here. There's these filters. So these are the ones that have been enabled for this picture. The star is the ones that are my favorites. And then these different categories: a basic, a tone, a color. What was this one? Is the corrections, and then effects. So the bloom, if we enable that one, shows up under the effects. And now we could turn on a bloom. I'll be honest, I don't know exactly what that does. And then you just click on it to cycle through those 3 different options of enabled or disabled. So some of the things that I like to do in a photo, I will show you here. So we'll switch back to, we'll go with this one. So there's a few things I've done here. I did my denoising, and then you can see the picture is not quite lined up. It's also pretty dark. It's more dark on this projector than it should be. So I applied a crop. Let's go to this one, and I'll just walk you through this. So the crop, if we go to crop, we can, when I selected it, you can open and close any of these without applying the module. So I open up the crop and rotate, and I can either click on it on any of these controls on the window to enable it, or I can click the enable button. And then it's crop and rotate, so I can crop it by sliding my window, or you can rotate by right-clicking and choosing what you want. So I find something that should be flat, like a nice flat lake, and then let go, and then you can fine-tune that angle if you want to. You can zoom in with the mouse wheel. There, that looks better. All right, so then we can do our base curve. Pick that up. Of course, this is a JPEG, so it may not have quite as much. This one's kind of dark, but I liked those clouds. And then let me grab one of these others that I've already manipulated and walk you through what not that one. So I didn't do a whole lot to that one. I don't remember which one I had ready for you. Well, regardless. So the exposure tool changes your blacks and your whites. And for that, it's really handy to use this little button down here, which will toggle your, it'll show you what things are at your black and what things are at a fully exposed point. So the red things up here, these clouds, these are fully exposed. The blacks, there's a lot of blacks. So I might want to lower that black point a little bit and clear out some of those. I like to leave just a little bit of black so that it's not too washed out. And then the exposure, I would actually probably crank that up a little bit. So this is raising the overall exposure of the entire picture. And there are multiple ways to get the same effect. You could do something similar with the levels. You can manipulate your gray point here. Or you could do that with your base curve. And this base curve is probably too strong. And then say you wanted to just do something to part of the picture. So a lot of times you want to maybe increase the light levels on somebody's face. There was one picture I had where the person was wearing a hat, and so it was kind of casting a shadow across the face. I wanted to brighten up the face just a little bit because all the rest of the lights were pretty good. This is where you can use a great tool down here, not on the base curve. So let's go to like the shadows and highlights. So if we click that on, say we like that look, but we want to bring out part of it more than another. We can do a blending. So you can do blending uniformly across the entire picture, which it does by default, but the uniform allows you to use different blend modes. So actually a better example of that would be this high pass filter. If the sharpening if the sharpen filter doesn't sharpen as much as you like, I like to do a high pass filter. So we turn that on. You'll see it finds all the places that there's a lot of contrast, and it's going to bring those out. So this is obviously not quite what we want. We want to blend it, and we're going to blend it in the three I like, and you kind of just play with it to see which one looks best. I blend it in an overlay mode. Overlay, soft light, or hard light are the ones I typically like. And they, you can back it off a little bit, but you can see how before and after it just brings that sharpness out a little bit. So that's a uniform blending. You can also do masks. So let's go back to our shadows and highlights. Oh, what did I do here? So we're going to do this with a drawn mask. Say we wanted to bring out just this park here. We can draw around what we want. So I'm using the mouse wheel to increase the size. So I'll draw something on here. And you can see that the rest of the picture went back to its normal defaults. And just the part that I've masked off, you can show the mask itself. You'll see it creates a line. We can manipulate these around. We can increase the size of it. We can blur out the edges a little bit. We can decrease the opacity. And create different shapes, draw your own curves, or use a gradient. So really powerful to be able to tweak. If you want to just manipulate the colors or the light levels in a certain place, masks are what you want.
Do you need more than one with each module?
So yes and no. So each module can only have one mask at a time, but you can create. So you could do that. You could flatten it and then do it again. Or in this recent version, they just added a feature where you can add multiple instances of a module. So if we do that, oops, we click on that, we'll create a new instance. And now this one is still, so number 9 is our original one. And number 10 is this new one that doesn't seem like 9 did anything. But yeah, so then you can stack those. I don't know that there's a limit on how many. I've never run into. I've done 3 or 4 before, and never had a practical use for doing 30 or 50. But yeah, so then you could do, if you want to darken one area and lighten a different area. Certainly with the drawn masks, you can have non-contiguous masks. So if you want to do the same thing in multiple places, you can draw your masks separately and do them all at once. So shadows and highlights I find is a pretty powerful one to bring down the highlights, bring out some of the details in the shadows, evens the picture out a little bit. Usually after I do a shadows and highlights, I'll throw back in with a local contrast. This is a little bit more sharpening, just brings in some contrast that tends to go away when you manipulate the shadows and highlights. And that's a lot of what I usually do in a photo. And let's see, here was this example of one that I came up with that I thought looked pretty good. I think this was the one. Yeah, so the exposure. So exposure goes across the entire image. And then you can see the difference in the shadows and the highlights. It brings more detail back into those clouds, brings out a lot of the details in the city. Another really useful one is the graduated density. If you've used a graduated density filter on your camera, which I've never used a physical one, but I've seen them online, this applies it the same way, just in software. It doesn't have quite the same effect because you're not manipulating the light itself, but you're manipulating the effect. But because we have that additional detail in the raw file, the graduated density filter can be useful. If we set our saturation, so you can see any area that's been turned purple has had that graduated density applied. It's too much. So it's got this compression. So if it's got 0 compression, then it feathers real gradually across the image. If you have a heavy compression, then you'll see that the purple like went away up in the city, so it's a real hard line across there. So really nice for when you're taking pictures of a sunset or something like that, if you want to even out the city. And speaking of that, Darktable does have the ability to do HDR. It's not a dedicated HDR tool, but it can do some. So I threw in an HDR here somewhere. So this is an HDR that I did up with a set of pictures. So you can compare, I think it was this one. Between the HDR, because it's combining, it's got that a little bit more. But what you want to do if you're doing an HDR, is you go back to Lighttable mode, and I've got them tagged here in groups with the colors. So you select the ones that you want, and then you come over here and you say create HDR. And once you do that, it'll create a DNG file that combines those. So that does actually create a new file, and then you can open up that one and manipulate it. And if you've done HDR, you'll know you want to do your tone mapping, and that is called Global Tone Map. So it doesn't have all the features that a lot of dedicated HDR tools do. Not as many algorithms, not as many tools, but it's useful. And could be a starting place for exporting to a different tool. And let me check my notes here. I think that's it. So were there any questions? Anything I can answer? All right. So
most of the time when I'm working with them, I want to highlight I'll either have the sky too overexposed or the surface underexposed. Is there an easy way to just select one part or the other and apply?
Yeah. So you can.
So here, if I want to bring out the landscape, I like the clouds. I want to leave those alone. Use exactly what it is, but I want to.
Yeah. So for example, if we wanted to grab the levels and bring up the lightness, but is this our DNG? Let's go to this one here. So we'll go back. Let's go back to here. So okay, so in this example here, we've got pretty good light levels in the sky, but we want to bring that up on the ground. So we could do a few different things. You could do a graduated filter and darken the sky and then bring the whole picture up. Or you could do the graduated filter in reverse and do it on, going up and bring that up. Or you can also do, we want to go to like our exposure mode. Exposure. I'm going to grab exposure, and we're going to do a blend, and we would do a drawn mask. So we could do, we'll just draw a mask here across the ground, and then we can increase the exposure of just the things that are masked off. So that's a few different options for doing that. But yeah, you can definitely manipulate just certain parts of the picture that you want. And we want to blur that a little bit so it doesn't. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay. Anything else I can answer? All right. So I hope that's been useful to you. Like I said, it's been a great tool for me for making pictures that I really enjoy. There's certainly a lot more power there than I'm sure that I'm capable of, but I hope it is a useful tool for you. So, thank you.